Hi, everyone. Thanks for staying for the last session, and thanks for the conference organizers for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm coming all the way from New York, and I'm taking this as an taking this as an opportunity to really show the work of photographers that are emerging, many of whom are emerging, and who I feel would probably not have an opportunity in the near future to show their work at the Tate Modern. So for me, this is very much an exhibition opportunity for them. Today I will present the work of 8 women photographers from around the world. Nona Faustine and Nikia Brown from the United States, Namsam Leuba from Switzerland and Guinea, Oriane Lopez from France, Liliana Angulo Cortez from Colombia, Delphine Fwandu from Sierra Leone, Jana Ireland and Hernez Davis, who's also here today, both from the United States. I've been able to speak to them directly about their work through interviews published on my blog, Dodge and Burn, Diversity in Photography History. These 8 photographers have specifically staged actions for the camera, constructing liberated visions of female blackness. So many of them reference historical images of the black female body in their own work. So first I'd like to take a look at a few popular examples within Western visual art history spanning the 16th through 20th century. Here we see 3 portraits that typically appear within the first page of Google image search results for the term negress in art history. The image on your left is the negress of Katharina, 1521, a drawing by German artist Albrecht Dürer. In the middle is Portrait d'une Negresse, painted in 1800 by French aristocrat Marie Guillemine Benoist. And on the right is Dinah, Portrait of a Negress, circa 1866, by American painter Eastman Johnson, who also founded the Metropolitan Museum. Though there are claims that these are sensitive studies of black women, all 3 subjects have been identified as slaves, which in their time would position them as socially subordinate to their painters. The look in each of their eyes also speaks volumes about their unwillingness to be pictured, ultimately having no say in the way their bodies are presented. Early on in the colonial history of photography, women of the African diaspora are portrayed in a critical manner, not worthy of admiration, respect, or humanity. This scientific image of a Khoikhoi woman of southwestern Africa was part of an album presented in an ethnographic showcase at the 1889 Parisian World Fair. Scientific images like these define the, quote, Hottentot stereotype, a derogatory Dutch term that came to symbolize the sexual and economic exploitation of black women by men, white and black alike. On the left, we see J.T. Zeeley's daguerreotype of Delia, a southern slave who, also photographed against her will, displayed as a specimen, trapped within a system of representation. Delia's image, and others of her family members, was commissioned in 1850 by Swiss scientist Louis Agassiz, used as scientific visual evidence to prove the racial superiority of the white race and promote the separation of the races. It's also important to note that photographer Qiana Mestich would later discover Zeeley's images in Harvard University's archive and repurpose them in her 1955 series titled From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. On the right is an image circa 1855 by an unidentified photographer of an African-American nanny seated with a white child. The black female as domestic servant, housemaid, and caregiver prevails as a stereotypical image in 20th century America, propagated on the big screen as seen in this still of Hattie McDaniel playing the character Mammy in the 1939 film Gone with the Wind. The caregiver stereotype is even branded within iconic works of documentary photography, as in this image from Robert Frank's 1958 series, The Americans. So in the late 20th century, 3 women photographers came to prominence in the United States during the era of multiculturalism influenced by the culture wars of the late 1980s and 90s. They are the Americans Lorna Simpson and Carrie Mae Weems, and the Jamaican-born Renee Cox. Many of the women photographers I've interviewed have cited them as inspiration. There are also visual strategies and performative devices introduced in the works of Simpson, Weems, and Cox that are referenced and employed by the emerging photographers I would later present. So I'm just going to run through a couple of sort of very infamous images from each photographer. This is Water Bearer from 1986 by Lorna Simpson. Stereo Styles, 1988. Moving on to Carrie Mae Weems's work, Kitchen Table Series, 1990. Self-portrait, titled I Looked and Looked to See You, to See What Terrified You, 2006. And an image from the Louisiana Project from 2003. Moving on to Renee Cox. This image is titled Cousins at Pussy Pond. That's Renee on the left. And that's Renee in the middle. This image is Your Mama's Last Supper, 1996. This was a very controversial image when it was shown at the Brooklyn Museum, 2001, I believe. The mayor at the time thought that it should not be shown in any sort of museum institution supported with public funds. And he sought to ban the image from the Brooklyn Museum. And the image on the left is actually an image taken by Lionel Ashton Harris of Cox performing the Hottentot Venus. And then the image on the right is Queen Nanny of the Maroons by Cox from 2006. So now I'll go on to talk about the sort of photographers. Traumatized by J.T. Zeeley's daguerreotypes of the South Carolina slave family, Nona Faustine uses photography and performance to connect with both public and personal histories of slavery in the United States. Her series, White Shoes, charts the presence of many African slave burial grounds and auction sites in New York City, long covered by concrete and skyscrapers. This is taken at City Hall in New York. Faustine employs her own body to mark the presence of her could-be ancestors on these sites. Invading the cityscape, Faustine's large brown body propped in white pumps, which she says symbolizes white patriarchy, also speaks to beauty politics and legacies of violence pathologies on the black female body. With her assistant, her sister Shannon, Faustine stages photo shoots around New York City landmarks just after dawn in an effort to avoid being arrested for public indecency. When asked to describe her process and performance for the camera, Nona had this to say in her interview. It's an amazing and terrifying and exhilarating sensation. I always get a little sick with my stomach doing black flips and somersault. Being nude in public is one of the most emotional, vulnerable states of being you will ever experience. At some point, you give into it and becomes natural. But there's a process to getting there first. Once you do, you almost forget the absence of your clothes. There were mornings when the temperature dipped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, but I didn't feel the cold because my adrenaline was pumping so hard. The threat of arrest and police dropping out of nowhere is constant. Therefore, I have to work quickly. New Yorkers are remarkable in that very little phases us. In that short span of time, people are walking by, sometimes cars are passing me by, like at Wall Street. I was stuck in the middle of the intersection, standing on a block of wood, as the spotlight changed. Cars and taxis passed me by while I was completely naked. I just gave myself over to the moment. You have to give up a certain amount of control. The city's in constant flow. You absorb its energy in that space and time. Your senses are heightened. Sometimes you have to find a way to tune all of that out, but still be aware of what is going on and to focus and get the shot. On occasion, when people notice, it gives me a little pleasure to add that vision to their memory. I become one of the New York stories they won't soon forget. And this is Nona on the shores of the Coney Island beach, which is part of the Atlantic. Next, I'll talk about Nakia Brown. Nakia Brown's photography work illustrates the contemporary and often political conversation happening worldwide around natural unprocessed hair. In her series, The Refutation of Good Hair, Brown's portraits of young black women eating synthetic hair is at once nauseating and yet a potent reminder of often universal and unattainable beauty standards forced upon generations. The satirical act of consuming artificial hair forces the viewer to confront the ludicrous concept of, quote, good hair as referenced in the series title. The term good hair is a colloquial phrase used within African American and Latin American communities and is part of the social phenomenon known as colorism, which favors persons, often of mixed race, with lighter skin tones or more European hair textures. In my interview, Brown herself makes the connection between consumption and African American beauty ideals, saying, quote, for decades, the idea that African American hair fell short of beautiful prevailed as a common definition of feminine beauty. A number of features define beauty, and this series focuses on hair. The idea of, quote, good hair is recontextualized to a new meaning, its literal meaning. The work is about accepting a new idea of what is beautiful, but also bringing those old ones to the forefront of discussion. Nansa Leoba embraces the seduction inherent in fashion photography to stage hybrid expressions rooted in African tribal customs and spiritual traditions. Working in both editorial and documentary genres, Leoba's style is fluid, decorative, and confounds normative definitions of African identity. In her editorial work, Leoba often imposes her unique aesthetic on European models. These two images are from Nansa Leoba's series Ya Kala Ben, 2011, shot in her mother's home country of Guinea, employs strategies reminiscent of visual anthropology to explore the animist and supernatural aspects of Guinean culture. In making the work, Leoba herself was involved in various ceremonies and rituals and says her subjects were often stressed because they were not used to being models or being photographed. The images relate to her interest in fetishes and a desire to separate those sacred statuettes from the religious context in order to immortalize them in a Western framework. That's a direct quote from Namsa. Leoba's later series, The African Queens, from 2012, a fashion editorial shot for New York Magazine, also incorporates ritualistic objects and regalia. Through the language of fashion photography shot in the studio, these models personify the African statuettes Leoba was inspired by. The neon colors and constructed fine art aesthetic and designer clothing places these queens within a contemporary haute couture world in which African Black female bodies are rarely seen. In her series of parodic images, The Melanies, Orion Lopez confirms sexualized representations of women of African descent in Euro-American visual culture. In one image, she at once references American performers Billie Holiday, Josephine Baker, and the Hottentot Venus Sarah Saki Bartman. Lopez does not use her own body in this work, simply because she self-identifies as a white woman of Portuguese descent. When I asked Lopez why make this work now, she stated, quote, "This work is the result of a reflection I had about the representation of the Black female body in Western visual culture during different times and contexts up until the present day. I wanted to reinterpret the trivializations made by ethnographic photography of the colonial period and by contemporary erotic images. Through these quirky and sometimes parodic pictures, I try to question the image of the Black African woman and its aesthetic and sexual stigmatization. In a manner, the work also highlights the supremacy of white standards in the fashion industry and in advertising." Liliana Angulo Cortez from Colombia explores racial identity as expressed within Afro-Colombian culture, often creating self-portraits to confront social stereotypes and reaffirm Colombia's African ancestry, which is often denied in favor of its mestizo, European and Amerindian ancestry. Cortez leverages the historical significance of the concept of Black within Colombian culture, not only as a color, but also infers circumstances of exploitation and domination, specifically challenging limited, often violent definitions of Black femininity. Interchangeably using her own body and those of models, Angulo's performance work tells us much about Central America's colonial and patriarchal past and its ideologies that are still inserted within contemporary life. For example, this is a series that she did sort of challenging a cartoon called Negra Nieves, meaning Black Snow, that is actually a cartoon written by a white woman and published in a daily Colombian paper still to this day. Adama Delphine Fwandu, her online project, Deconstructing She, examines the theory of social constructivism in the development of identity. Through this performance art series of silent monologues, Delphine Fwandu transforms herself into various personalities as she delves into this investigation of self and society. Fwandu performs Blackness across diaspora, fluidly crossing borders, bodies, and cultures. Using herself as surrogate to portray various characters across space and time, she questions, what exactly does an African look like? What does it mean to be Black? What is gender? Who is she? In sharing the work, Fwandu posts these images via a Tumblr blog, one of the internet's most popular photography platforms, thus digitally propagating her visual investigations for a seeking audience. Jana Ireland. In the series The Spotless Mirror, photographer Donna Island merges autobiography, and fantasy, staging mundane moments in the life of a married Black woman occupying the opulent home of her white in-laws. Of her performative portrait, Ireland says, quote, "The portraits in the spotless mirror were a way of performing in private. I've always been interested in performance, but actually doing it in front of other people is very difficult for me," end quote. With references to European styles of painting filled with objects signifying purity, wealth, and pedigree, Ireland's images raises questions around the economics of her character living in this house. Singular images like this one place the character in shadow, this one here, hiding her identity. And yet here, she stares back in defiance of skeptical viewers, rightly claiming her house, her place as woman of the house. And last but not least, we have Hernez Davis. Using traditional black and white darkroom techniques, Hernez Davis' a series of photograms titled "A Womb of My Own, Mistakes Were Made in Development," are literally developed out of desire for rebirth and renewal. Davis physically connects photography and performance by placing her own body on the surface of the silver gelatin paper. And these are life-size self-portraits. Of her performative self-portraits, she says, quote, "I make my photograms in my living room, shutting out all the light. In complete darkness, I set up my paper, and then I lay down. This 48 by 60-inch space is a surface for movement, rest, meditation, anger, etc. I trigger a flash of light when I am ready and done. Each panel is developed individually to complete the image, but also serves as another dark space of self-care." In the words of Audre Lorde, quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." Using photography as self-care behavior, Davis is engaging in a kind of sacred pampering never before seen in the history of photography, a creative act of wellness that for centuries has been denied to Black women. Like their predecessors, this new generation of women artists are using photography to claim ownership of the portrayal of the Black female body and persona. Staging private and public performances in front of the camera, their work is a rich compendium of voices speaking to multiple Black female identities that deconstruct stereotypes, thus empowering all women. Thank you.